Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to see we have such a large crowd today. It's good. More the merrier. Do we have any public comment at this time? You unmute yourself if you have a comment.
Yeah, folks, if you have anything you'd like to say, feel free to unmute. And there will be time as we go through the agenda for folks to comment.
You know, I've been on a lot of this. Has got the little hand raising thing, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Very good. Always raise your hand. Okay, I'm not hearing any. We'll move on to 3, the Mid-Korea GSA GSP review status. I'll let you take it away from there.
Yeah, thanks everybody. As you're aware, we've been working diligently through a lot of the 3 comments that were provided by Department of Water Resources. And so with all that work being done, I think we're at a stage now where we're ready to share the red lines and the revisions that we're making to the GSP. And so what we're going to do today is kind of cover some background information. I'll be turning it over to Derek Williams, our consultant, to go through the actual red lines. We are not going to go red line by red line. What Derek is going to do is to offer an overview of the red lines so that you have an understanding of what was done. And then we'll be providing those red lines on our website for people to download and review. But I would say that and I've seen parts of the presentation that Derek's going to give us, that's going to give you the best look at what the revisions are versus having to go in and read the individual red lines. So to start off, just give folks an orientation on the position of where we're at today. We were submitted our GSP to Department of Water Resources on January 31st of 2020. And under SGMA, the Department of Water Resources was given 2 years to review and evaluate our GSP. I would say during that 2-year period, DWR did a pretty miraculous job. They really kept tight-lipped. We didn't hear anything for 2 years. But on December 9th, 2021, we were notified that DWR had found deficiencies in our GSP. We weren't informed on what those deficiencies were, but that a pending incomplete review was coming our way. So on January 28th, we did receive that notice from Department of Water Resources to the Kauai subbasins through our point of contact over at the Greater Kauai. It was subsequently distributed, and in that incomplete, to summarize their comments, they found 3 deficiencies. The approach that we took for chronic lowering of groundwater levels, the approach we took for subsidence, and our approach on interconnected surface water. So while I greatly appreciate that we only had 3 deficiencies to fix, the deficiencies we had to fix were kind of a reorganization and redo of all 3 of those elements. So I know our advisory committee members and the public that participated in that process to develop the 2020 GSP, one of those alone probably took 4 to 5 months. And so we were trying to cram 3 of those into a 6-month period. We have 180 days to address those comments. And so our comments are now due on July 27th. And I'll put that all into perspective here in a minute. So where we're at this is the SGMA pathways chart that DWR uses to explain to folks how the process works. We're right here at this stage where we've been deemed incomplete. So we have the 180 days to address our deficiencies, and we hope by the end of this year, we end at this next assessment phase. And our goal, the directive or our approach was to simply achieve this outcome, which is going to be our approval and our continuance of the implementation of our GSP. So what process did we use in the Kauai subbasin? We had a technical support team consisting of Montgomery Associates and Provost and Pritchard. They worked collectively to address the 3 deficiencies from a technical standpoint. Some of this cost will be offset by our recent DWR grant. Otherwise, the 3 GSAs are picking up that technical work equally on the cost share. The actual revisions, if you remember, there are 3 GSPs in the Kauai subbasin stitched together by a coordination agreement. And so the revisions themselves in the GSP are being handled by different parties. So Montgomery and Associates and Derek is tackling the mid-CWIAs, and he'll be giving our presentation, while Provost and Pritchard is handling the greater CWIA and the East CWIA, and they're on a very similar path to move forward. We have weekly sub-basin calls of a technical nature. This has technical staff, legal counsel, GSA managers, and consultants to unpackage, take comments and concerns that we receive through our public process, envelop those in the technical work, and then move forward. And every week, Derek and his team and Matt and his teams were coming back with, we crunch these numbers and this is how it looks. Okay, next decision. And they go back and forth every week. But that window was actually very short, and I'll show you why. And then we also had 3 meetings with DWR to provide progress updates and seek some general head nods and direction from DWR. So we did get some feedback from them. Some of that feedback came back as affirmation of the approach we were taking. Others came back that a different direction was kind of warranted there. So they were good meetings, some of them happening very recently that caused a lot of rework of what we were doing. From a public participation standpoint, we've made sure to include the public in our conversations as much as we can. It's quite difficult as we're working nonstop on some of this, but we made sure from the mid-CWIA perspective, and I would say the other GSAs were doing the similar path, involving their stakeholder committees or rural stakeholder committees or technical advisory committees. We were holding multiple meetings. Mid-CWIA alone had 6 advisory committee meetings, and each one of those we provided an update, and any feedback that came out of those meetings was reported directly back to the technical group, or Derek carried the message back with him as he was giving the presentations at most of the advisory committee meetings. We also had one CWIA sub-basin management committee meeting, and that's a meeting where we collect the 3 GSAs and the elected officials and give updates. And that, I think that happened last month. And then TID was giving monthly reports to its board at its board meetings. So as much public participation as we could put out there, and then more to come starting today. So just where we're kind of came from, and as you know, how we processed it. February, we were basically got the letter and tried to unpackage it to understand what the comments were, how we were going to address it. So it took about 30 days, get the team put together, who's going to address what, how we're going to address it, set up the weekly meetings, that sort of thing. By March, we were beginning to meet with the managers and staff and consultants. In April, as I looked back, we really got to the development of the chronic lowering of groundwater levels approach. By May, we were continuing that groundwater level work and then began the subsidence work. Oh shoot, I forgot. So that's June. We continued to work on subsidence and begin work on interconnected surface water. And then by the July time period, we're trying to finalize and upload the document. But overall, the technical work really happened over 120 days approximately to do all the work there. So we lose the front end and the back end is kind of preparation and uploading on the backside. I really want to thank the consultants and the technical support teams, the attorneys, the staff that supported this. Many of you won't hear, but I want to make sure it's known that we were trading emails and phone calls at 11 o'clock at night. I don't think anybody didn't work a weekend to try and get this accomplished. A lot of nights talking with Derek about, does this make sense? Does that not make sense? Talking with Matt. I'll be very honest, we were all interrupting Matt on his vacation to deal with this. So without those contributions beyond hours, the normal working hours, we would not be in a position right now to deliver a red line document to you folks for consideration. So today, what we're trying to do is to give you an overview of the approaches used for the 3 revisions, chronic lowering of groundwater levels, subsidence, and interconnected surface water. On the interconnected surface water, we're kind of participants in the sub-basin, but the comments were specific to the East Kauai and the Greater Kauai. But nonetheless, it's part of the evaluation that we work together on. We anticipate uploading the red line revisions sometime later today or tomorrow. This is how ongoing this is. Georgina King, who worked on our documents, not with us today because she's working on the documents, so we can get the red lines over to me so I can upload them to the website hopefully later tonight or tomorrow. You'll be able to pick those up on our MKGSA website, and then we'll have the coordination agreement red lines that reflects the GSP revisions. So they're not very different than what's in the GSP. They just codify it in the coordination agreement. That coordination agreement red lines might be trailing a little bit after the GSP red lines. And then we're requesting folks that would like to review those red lines and provide any comments to get those comments back to me at my email or call me by July 12th. We know that's a very short window. We can take comments beyond that, but we can't guarantee that we get those incorporated in the document, because after the 12th comes, then Montgomery & Associates will begin packaging the document up to get it ready for board consideration on July 20th. So with that, let me stop really quick. Is there any questions on the background and the process? I think we're ready then, maybe Derek, and I apologize. Let me turn over control to you.
All righty. Let's see if I've got nope, not yet. Let's see here.
I'm turning it over right now.
Any minute now. Fantastic. There we go. All right. Well, thanks very much, Aaron. And thank you, members of the board and advisory committee, and Chair Martin and Chair Wilbur. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to talk a little today about sort of where the GSP is right now. This is going to be a very high level talk. There's a lot of information in the GSP. The talk that I'm going to give you today is simply a talk to try and guide you through the important parts so you don't get bogged down in the details, and really to get to the bottom line, to say, if you want to skip all the details, this is the important fact that's at the back of it, that's at the end of the GSP. This is the end of the story. So I'm going to give you that information also. If you want if you have any questions or want more information about the details that went into this, happy to talk about any of them. There's a lot more of the story that you're going to see actually in the GSP. I do want to emphasize something that Aaron said. All of this information, all of the decisions that were made were done through a long collaborative process from the GSA managers, all three GSA managers, and working with Provost and Pritchard and ourselves. It was an in-depth process, took a lot of discussions. I think we've got to a place where we're in very good shape for getting an approved GSP, but it was a long road to get there. But hats off to everybody who worked on it. It was a long one to get there. So with that, feel free to interrupt, by the way, although I am a talker, so you'll have to interrupt loudly. But I will try and stop at a few places in my presentation to take questions as they come up here. I want to start with just a recap to remind you of a few things, and Aaron already discussed a couple of these things. As he mentioned, DWR identified 3 deficiencies in their letter to us. One was groundwater level SMCs, land subsidence SMCs. I think everybody is up on the acronym SMC, Sustainable Management Criteria. I'm going to use that a lot during this presentation. So when you see it, those are the criteria that were judged on. And then the interconnected surface water SMC, which was not mid-Kauai concern. I'm going to touch on it at a very, very high level just to let you know what's going forward. And mid-Kauai staff, Aaron especially, is watching it, but we don't have input really into the process. We are simply watching that. I do want to point out that, and I brought this up at meetings before, our read of DWR's letter is that they are focusing on the process and following the regulations. We need to follow the regulations and follow the process more than the numbers. Now, that's not to say the numbers are not important. If our numbers are way off, they are going to say that doesn't pass. But it was also important that we follow a process that DWR felt was the process laid out in Sigma that protects beneficial uses and users. And this is the process that we worked on. Originally, in the original GSP, the process was to start with where we thought groundwater conditions were going, and then talk about how that impacted users. We've switched that around and said, who are the users and how would they be impacted? And knowing who the users are and how they might be impacted, say, okay, what are the thresholds where they are not impacted? And that's where we want to end up, and then develop projects to make sure we end up there. So the process that was changed, which was important, and I'm going to hit this a couple times because I think it is important to DWR, is that the groundwater users' needs drive the future conditions, not just what might happen. So that's kind of a recap, a couple things that I had brought up previously. Those are the big overarching drivers of our change. The sections that we revised are in red. Now, we didn't revise these sections completely. We revised parts. And I'll tell you why we revised them. Clearly, the chronic lowering of groundwater levels, we had to revise that SMC because that was a stated deficiency. And the land subsidence SMC, that was a stated deficiency also. So we revised those wholesale. And what you will see in the red line version is we didn't just go in and change certain words. We just wrote entire new sections and plugged them in there. So those are going to be brand new sections that are just plugged into the report. Because we had to change those, there's a couple other things we had to change that I'm going to touch on. The reduction in groundwater storage SMC relies on groundwater levels. So we had to follow the logic through and say we have new groundwater levels. That leads to new reduction in groundwater storage. I'll talk about that a little later. We also, as we'll talk about later, Aaron really is working hard at improving the mitigation plan, the well mitigation plan. That's part of the projects and management actions. So there's an update on Chapter 7, the projects and management actions, that focuses on the mitigation plan update. And also the sustainability goal and undesirable results. We really didn't change the goal, but the undesirable results, because of the way they are defined, gets dropped into these two deficiencies. I'll show you that right here. So what happens is the old section 3 talked about sustainability goal and undesirable results. But sustainable management criteria, if you remember, and you might not, I only remember because I live this every day, an undesirable result has to be at least partially defined as a quantitative number of minimum threshold exceedances. If you say we exceed the minimum threshold at so many wells, that's what defines when you're having an undesirable result. If you exceed your groundwater level minimum threshold at a third of the wells in your basin, you're having an undesirable result. Because they are linked, we took the undesirable result out of this overall chapter and added it back in to link them to the minimum thresholds a little more closely. So that's just a small little change. It's not that important there. But I am now going to go over almost all. I just went over the most basic one, Chapter 3. I am going to go over in a little more detail each of these, especially the deficiency 1 and the deficiency 2. And then I'm going to touch on the groundwater storage, and I'm going to have Aaron touch on the well mitigation plan. I will stop after each of the main deficiencies to take questions. Are there any questions so far? Don't see any. Okay, don't hear any. I'll move on. So I'm going to talk about the first deficiency, which is the chronic lowering of groundwater levels, SMC. Again, we start with the process that we believe DWR is interested in, and that is identify who the uses and users are and what is significant and unreasonable. And this information I have presented to you in a previous presentation. When it comes to groundwater levels, it was decided that significant and unreasonable is groundwater levels dropping below the bottom of a well. That's what we were going to establish as significant and unreasonable. Now, we also decided that managing the shallowest well in the basin is unreasonable. We can't have the shallowest well in the basin control how we're going to manage the entire basin. You get one person saying, you have to manage the basin for me and me alone. And that's unreasonable. But we did decide we wanted to protect 90% of all the wells in the basin. So that's what's significant and unreasonable now, is not only the bottom of the well, but making sure we protect at least 90% of all those wells. And the question is, what are all those wells? Well, we could look back to the very first well log and say, is that well still around? But after analyzing the number of wells that have been installed recently, when wells were installed, what depth they were installed to, we looked at all those data and said, wells drilled in the last 20 years, there's a lot of them. They reflect wells that were drilled to overcome problems with recent droughts. And they probably have more modern well construction standards. So those are the wells we're working on when we're talking about wells that we don't want groundwater levels to drop below. We want these wells that were installed in the last 20 years. And that's about 3,100 wells. So it's not a small number of wells that we're analyzing. So that's what is significant and unreasonable. Remember, significant and unreasonable is the description of what you don't want to happen. And that eventually leads to your minimum threshold. You quantify that in your minimum threshold. So how do we quantify this? Well, we went about it a few ways, and I'm not going to go through this because I'm going to go through each of these boxes independently. But effectively, we looked at groundwater levels in a few ways to make sure we were being protective. One of them being just what I talked about, making sure we're protecting 90% of the wells, and then making sure that that doesn't mean we have very low water levels or there are outliers. That's what these three boxes mean. And don't worry about that right now. I'm going to describe this to you, and hopefully it'll make more sense by the time I get to my end of my description. This is important, though, because it is a multi-pronged process that if you are reading the GSP, I don't want you to get lost in. I want you to understand the overall process. And that's what I'm going through now. So it'll make sense when you read the GSP. So the first methodology, the first approach we take is to protect 90% of the wells, and that's by zone. So the map here shows, let's see, no, it's soapy. The map here shows the zones that we set up in the subbasin. There are 39 of them. The zones that have a brown area both have an upper zone and a lower zone because they're above and below the Corcoran clay. And the zones to the east are what we call in the single aquifer here. So we're not protecting 90% of the wells throughout the basin as a whole, because wells out near Hanford are going to be constructed very differently than wells out on the east side, out in Wood Lake and out there. So we don't want to lump them all together and say they are all look the same. We break them up into zones, and we protect 90% of the wells in every zone. So in this zone here, well 35, the westernmost zone, we would look at the well construction data and say protecting 90% of those wells means water levels could drop to some level. Let's say 150 feet below ground surface. I have no idea what it was. Let's say 150 feet below ground surface. That's for the deep aquifer. We would then say any monitoring well out there, we're going to set the minimum threshold initially by looking at that monitoring well, saying the minimum threshold is set 150 feet below ground surface. If out on the east, we're only protecting 90% of the wells at a depth of, say, 50 feet below ground surface. Any monitoring well out east then would have a protective elevation that is set 50 feet below ground surface. So we do this zone by zone, and every zone has 90% of the wells in that zone protected. That's the first thing we do. Second thing we do is then we look at the rate of groundwater level, the groundwater level trend. Here's an example. The blue dots here are the recent water level measurements. We put a trend line through it and say, at 2040, where would that trend line end up? We don't want the water levels to be dropping faster than they are now in order to get to our minimum threshold. So if our minimum threshold at this well, this is just one of the wells, if our minimum threshold based on the previous approach was down on this yellow line, we're saying that yellow line, the groundwater elevation held at that yellow line protects 90% of the wells. But that means we would have a very steep decline in water levels. We don't want that. So we're going to just extend the existing decline in water levels and say, let's call that the minimum threshold now. It protects more than 90% of the wells. Remember, the deep water level protects 90% of the wells. We're going to say we're going to raise the water level and protect more than 90% of the wells in this situation. This didn't happen in a lot of wells, but it did happen in a few wells there. It did happen in a few areas that we raised the minimum threshold just to make sure that our water level decline didn't get too steep. So now we have a minimum threshold set at every well, either protecting 90% of the wells or protecting more than 90% of the wells in every zone. We then map them to make sure there's no outliers. We don't want a well that looks completely different than its neighbors because then it might be affecting its neighbors too much. So we did map them, and all the yellow wells that you see on this map were ones that we had to change the minimum threshold to make a more smooth contour map of the minimum thresholds. And so there were a few, I think it's 7 wells that we had to go in and say, if we're going to have a smooth contour map of minimum thresholds, we're going to change the minimum threshold there. So that's what the 3 steps were. And after this, you end up with a minimum threshold at every monitoring well that either protects 90% of the surrounding wells or more, and is smoothly contoured so it makes sense with all its surrounding wells. And that's how we set the minimum thresholds everywhere. We also had to set measurable objectives and interim milestones. Remember, the measurable objective is what we're shooting for. It is our goal that we would like to get to. It's shown here with the purple diamond. The minimum threshold, what we don't want to go below, is the red line. The purple diamond's what we're shooting for. The green triangles are the interim milestones. They're our tracking devices to say, are we heading towards the measurable objective or not? That's really all they are just devices to track our progress. The measurable objective often was retained at where it was in the 2020 GSP. What we wanted to make sure is there was adequate room between the minimum threshold and the measurable objective to provide us about 5 years of drought water supply. So if the measurable objective started too close to the minimum threshold, down here somewhere, we had to raise it to say, this is the objective we're going for, and during a drought, we will have water level, we will have room in our aquifer to let water levels drop for 5 years before we get to the minimum threshold. So we wanted to make sure this buffer was adequate here. And we had to raise the measurable objective in a number of wells, but not that many, it turns out. The interim milestones were set simply as a curved path between where we are now, actually not quite where we are now, but the trend of where we are going and the measurable objective. One thing to know about the measurable objective, it's not important here, it's going to be important later in my talk. It is our goal. If you don't hit your measurable objective, that's not an indication that you are managing unsustainably, because you are always trying to hit it. If you violate your minimum thresholds, that is a measure of managing unsustainably. So the minimum thresholds are where DWR steps in, because that's where they have to step in because you're not doing well. The measurable objectives are not where DWR steps in. We can hit them or not, but they are what the GSAs are shooting for. That is what's important to us. Those are our goals, and that's what we're trying to achieve. So in summary, on the chronic, when you read the chronic lowering of groundwater, SMCs, this is the take-home messages. Our minimum thresholds, first of all, they start with the process that DWR is interested in. They are driven by the beneficial uses and users and protecting at least 90% of those beneficial uses and users. That's what drives our minimum thresholds now. And we're going to protect at least 90% of them, if not more, and make sure that the rate of decline of groundwaters isn't any greater than it is currently. That's actually the same approach that was used in the 2020 GSP. The undesirable result, remember I said the undesirable result is a combination of minimum threshold exceedances. What if we go past the minimum threshold? How many minimum thresholds can we go past before we have an undesirable result? In the original GSP, it was set at 1/3 of all the wells. We said if we exceed if we drop below our water levels, our minimum threshold water levels, in more than 1/3 of our wells, that's undesirable. We just kept that. So it's the same number. We still don't want to drop below the water level, the minimum threshold water levels in more than 1/3 of our wells. Same measurement. Undesirable result, by the way, that is what triggers DWR stepping in and saying, you are having a problem. It's that number. The measurable objectives we adjusted where necessary to provide for at least 5 years of drought storage, and the interim milestones are markers that decrease over time to meet the measurable objective. That's the take-home message of where we ended up on lowering of groundwater levels. Be happy to take any questions right now, if there are any. And I don't know, Chair Martin, if you can see people raise hands or not. Yes.
Mr. Williams, would you mind going back about 2 or 3 frames? There was a question that I have, and it's just for me to get my own bearing here. Again, another. And
any of those
I think it had to do with the red lines that you had
this one
outlined. Would you go back
this
further,
one
please? No, sir. It's I guess it's further down than that.
I'm looking at all the red lines.
Okay, it was a listing of the 3 deficiencies outlined by DWR.
I didn't go back far enough. My problem. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, right here, I think. Yeah.
This one or this one?
Go back up a bit.
This one.
You passed it.
Okay.
Sorry.
No problem.
There we are. Okay,
Here
right there. All right. You have under item number 5, you have listed chronic lowering of groundwater levels. You also have land subsidence, which would be 2 of the deficiencies outlined by DWR. I'm looking at number 3, reduction in groundwater storage. Is that in reference to approach to interconnected surface waters, which is one of the deficiencies outlined by DWR?
Good question. It is not in the interconnected surface water. The interconnected surface water deficiency in the letter from DWR was a deficiency they had found in the Greater Cahuilla and East Cahuilla's plan. They specifically called it out that way. It was not called out as a deficiency in the Mid Cahuilla's plan, and therefore we did not change our description of that SMC in the Mid Cahuilla's plan. We have left it as is. The reduction in groundwater storage was only changed because it was reliant on the new groundwater levels. And since we changed the minimum threshold groundwater levels, it ripples through the It ripples through the plan into the reduction in groundwater storage, but that was not called out specifically. Reduction in groundwater storage was not called out specifically by DWR in their letter. We only changed it because it rippled through the plan.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Mr. Reeves.
Sure.
Derek, question on the same page. Reduction groundwater storage, is that an irreversible impact?
That is generally not an irreversible impact. Now, there is a question about how does this interplay with the subsidence, but for the groundwater storage SMC, for the actual criteria for groundwater storage, we talk about storage that can be refilled or taken out there.
Okay,
All the irreversible part all comes under the subsidence SMC.
okay. Good, thank you.
Sure. Mr. Stroman does bring up a good point. I have not listed all of the parts.
Derek, I got a
Yes.
question for you.
Yes.
I would assume we do these measurements on a regular basis. So this threshold would ebb and flow based on the findings that occur at the appointed times of measuring.
The threshold does not ebb and flow. The threshold we are setting. Now, if it turns out that we feel we should change the threshold for a good reason in the future, we can. But the threshold we are setting to say, this is where we don't want to go beyond, because going beyond this would be a significant impact on the beneficial users there. So that's how we're setting the threshold.
Okay.
Now, you are partially right. I'm hoping not to complicate this too much. It is a good idea to base our understanding of that threshold on water levels taken at the same time every year. We don't want to be mixing up fall water levels and spring water levels, because it will give us a very different look there. But the threshold remains the same.
Okay, thank you.
Just as a quick note for the advisory committee or any public, this is a public meeting, and I think if the chairman will entertain, I think we're opening it up to the floor. So it's a workshop. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to, Chair, if you're comfortable with that, we could take anybody's.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm looking for raised hands. Not seeing any. I think we can keep going, Derek.
Okay, thank you, Chair Martin. Let's see here. I will move along. This was groundwater levels. The next one is going to be the subsidence sustainable management criteria. This gets a little more complicated. That said, I'm pretty happy with where we ended up. I think we have a pretty strong story to tell right now. So I'll try and walk through this in an understandable way, and feel free to ask questions. Again, we want to start with who are the beneficial uses and users that are impacted by subsidence. And in this case, it's largely infrastructure. The sigma is actually written to say land uses, but if you're cropping some land and you're cropping some land at 200 feet elevation or 190 feet elevation, I don't think it makes a difference. So we're talking about infrastructure that might be impacted. And we looked at all these infrastructure that are on the left side here. And we agree that all of them could be impacted. And we are going to be monitoring all of these, or at least be aware of them as we go forward to say, are these being impacted by subsidence? That said, there is no history or no quantitative information locally on whether subsidence has impacted any of the lower five, roads and bridges, electrical power lines. We don't have any information that says historically subsidence in the area has impacted these to a certain degree. And therefore, we can't quantify. Remember, we have to quantify minimum thresholds and measurable objectives. We can't quantify subsidence based on these lower 5. We can, to some degree, quantify impacts from subsidence on the top 2. Water conveyance infrastructure, that's a catch-all term for creeks, canals, flood control, all sorts of things there. And so we've got some historical data that tells us how subsidence impacts those, and we can make some estimates on how subsidence impacts supply wells. So our SMC are based on these 2 infrastructures. Again, not to say the others aren't important. They are, but it's going to be very difficult to quantify SMCs based on these others. We can quantify impacts based on the top 2, and that's the way we went. Subsidence minimum thresholds have 2 parts. We had to ask DWR about this. In the legislation and in the regulations, it refers to a rate and extent. And we had to ask DWR, what do you mean by extent? And they say extent is everything. It's in what is the extent of subsidence in the X and Y direction across the land surface, and what's the extent of subsidence vertically? And that's the key one. What's the extent of subsidence vertically that's permissible? So we have to come up with 2 parts of this minimum threshold. What's the rate of subsidence that's going to be acceptable? And what's the total amount of subsidence, the vertical extent that's going to be acceptable? And we have to come up with both of those to have a subsidence minimum threshold that says this is the rate and extent, and we don't want to violate either one. We don't want to have subsidence go faster than the rate or have more subsidence than the extent that we set up. So that's where we ended up now, is with this rate and extent argument. So I'm going to go through each one. So the total amount of acceptable subsidence, we're going to base on impacts to infrastructure. The rate of subsidence that goes into the minimum threshold, we're going to base on historical rates. And I'll walk you through each of those independently. And we're going to end up at the end with a minimum threshold that has a rate and an extent. I'm going to start with the extent, the total amount of acceptable subsidence. We did it in a couple steps. We first looked at what is the worst case subsidence across the subbasin? And that is if all water levels dropped to their minimum thresholds and stayed there for 30 years. And we estimated it. And this is a map. The rest of the subbasin is masked back. This is a map just of the mid-Kauai area, which is highlighted here. And the subsidence that we are estimating runs from less than 5 feet in the blue areas up north of Visalia to probably over 30 feet as you get out towards Hanford. Now, these are just estimates. We don't know these are right, but these are our estimates right now of what could happen in the future. Also, this is not what we expect to happen. This is a worst case scenario. But it is our reasonable worst case scenario. This is the first cut. And we said, okay, so this is under the absolute worst case, this might be subsidence that we might end up seeing here. Then the question was, is that acceptable? Remember, we want our subsidence to be driven by beneficial uses and users. And the answer was, and this was what the GSA managers discussed this for a long time. And the decision was, no, that's an excessive amount of subsidence. And after some discussion, we capped the total subsidence to no more than 9 feet. And there's some reasons for that, having to do with wells, how wells are built with sleeves these days, things like that. But if we capped the subsidence at no more than 9 feet, we had a couple advantages. There were limited or no impacts on wells and canals. And also our maximum subsidence is similar to the thresholds in the surrounding basins. And this was important to the GSA managers that we're looking at, okay, we don't want to say our surrounding basin is only allowing 8 feet of subsidence, but we're allowing 25 feet of subsidence. So we wanted to be in coordination with our surrounding subbasins. This is something that probably is going to take more work going forward, but it is going to be important that we coordinate with our surrounding subbasins on the amount of subsidence that's acceptable. So this map, you'll see the green, this happens to be the same color scale as this map, in case you're wondering. It's just we have finer colors. So here, this green is 5 to 10 feet, and we have just expanded it. Same color scale, and you see that the maximum amount of subsidence for our minimum threshold, the extent of subsidence, is going to be 9 feet in most of the GSA area. As you get north of Visalia, it becomes less. I think this point right here, what's labeled K020, I think that's a little over 3 feet of subsidence. And the thought there was, it's less than 9 feet in the original, in the worst case scenario. We're going to leave that worst case scenario. It's about 3 feet of subsidence in this worst case scenario. We're not going to force it to be 9 feet. We're going to leave it at the 3 feet of subsidence up here. So we take this map and we attach a maximum subsidence at each of your monitoring points. These circles with a cross through them are the monitoring points you're using to measure subsidence here. And so we took this map and we attached the maximum amount of subsidence to each of these monitoring points there. That is how we came up with the extent. Like I said, the extent of subsidence is based on impacts, largely impacts to wells and impacts to canals and waterways. And we think this amount of subsidence does not have would not result in an unreasonable impact to those wells. Also, it's in line with the amount of subsidence in your neighboring subbasins. The second part of the subsidence is the rate. What would be an acceptable rate? One idea was just to say, well, if this is the total amount of subsidence, let's just divide it by some number of years. But it was agreed that during droughts, we could exceed that average subsidence rate pretty easily. So we didn't want to limit ourselves to just an average rate over a number of years. We wanted to give ourselves some flexibility to account for drought years. So what we did is we looked at 2 recent drought years. In 2015 to 2016, if I look at all the subsidence measurements across the subbasin, they ranged from virtually 0 subsidence along the east side of the subbasin to about 1.3 feet at its greatest. In 2021 to 2022, again, the least amount of subsidence was effectively 0, and the most was about 1.03 feet. So this is the range of subsidence we're expecting, or we have seen historically in drought years. Now, we could have just said, let's give ourselves a lot of leeway and choose the worst case. 1.3 feet is going to be our limit on our rate. The GSA managers agreed that that's probably too high. We could go lower, and the decision was to go about 2/3 of the way up this range, which turns out to be about 0.67 feet per year, about 8 inches per year. So that's the maximum rate of subsidence. It's not the rate we expect every year. It is a rate that we are setting to say during drought years, that's the rate we don't want to exceed right now. So now we have both the rate for our minimum threshold, 0.67 feet per year, and the extent of our minimum threshold, up to 9 feet. And we attach that to every one of the subsidence monitoring points, and you have your subsidence minimum threshold. And so this is the summary. The minimum threshold is no more than 9 feet total subsidence, that's the extent, and no more than 2/3 of a foot per year, that's the rate. Again, the undesirable result is the same as was in the previous GSP. Remember, we can exceed this minimum threshold at individual points, but we can't exceed these minimum thresholds at more than a third of the monitoring points. That would be an undesirable result. And that's what triggers DWR stepping in and saying, you aren't managing sustainably. So that's this undesirable result. We just carried it forward from this previous GSP. The measurable objective. This is where my earlier speech about measurable objectives comes into play. In discussions with DWR, they were clear that the appropriate measurable objective is zero subsidence after reaching a rate of zero subsidence after reaching sustainability. They didn't give all those words. I read a couple of those words into what they said, but the measurable objective is going to be a rate of zero subsidence, and this is reaching sustainability you can think of as 2040. So we would have zero subsidence after 2040. Like I say, we put that in your plan because DWR told us that is the correct thing to put in the plan. It is likely unrealistic. We told DWR it is likely unrealistic. They agree it is likely unrealistic. That's fine. This is where the speech comes back out. Achieving your measurable objective is not the measurement of sustainability. Going past too many minimum thresholds and having an undesirable result is your measurement of sustainability or unsustainability. And that's the only reason I am willing to follow DWR's recommendations and put in a rate of zero subsidence as our goal. We do want to be honest and say we have a goal of minimizing subsidence, and we do have that goal. Reaching zero will be difficult, but since it is not the measurement of sustainability, I am willing to say that that is our goal there, instead of just saying we would like to minimize subsidence. Be happy to talk any more about that if you've got questions. The interim milestones are similar to the interim milestones for water levels. We simply say this is the rate today, and we're incrementally going to decrease that rate of subsidence until 2040 when we reach our measurable objective of zero. That's the plan there. That is the take-home message from subsidence. It is a more complicated one to think about, and be happy to take any questions on subsidence now.
Derek, we have in the chat room, if you want to pull it up, we do have a question.
Okay, let's see here.
I'll read it out loud.
Thank you.
Oh, go ahead.
I've got too many windows going. Thank you.
Okay, that's all right. I'll just read it to you, Derek. Would exceeding the 0.67 feet per year rate on 1/3 of the monitoring points in any single year trigger the undesirable result?
Yes, it would. The minimum thresholds, you have to meet both things. You have to say, we are not going to exceed the rate of 0.67 feet per year in 1/3 of the monitoring points, and we are not going to go past 9 feet of subsidence in 1/3 of the monitoring points. Both those things have to be true. If either one of them is wrong, like the 0.67 feet, that would, in my opinion, trigger an undesirable result. It is not clearly stated in the regulations or the legislation, but in my opinion, the minimum threshold is an and statement. Both this and this have to happen, or you're exceeding your minimum threshold. That's just an opinion.
Great, thank you.
I have a question. In a previous conversation, Mr. Williams, I think that one of the attendees, I don't think it was a board member, but one of the attendees mentioned that zero subsidence was not feasible. However, because of this, in spite of this, DWR, their recommendation is zero subsidence, if I understand you correctly, which is slightly unrealistic. I think your response to that at that same meeting was that we would have to put in the plan submitted to DWR reasons for zero subsidence not being realistic. And this would help to formulate a focus on that issue that would be agreeable to DWR. In other words, they would allow us some wiggle room in that regard. And I think that that was the gist of your response as I understood it. Would you want to elaborate on that a bit more?
You are correct that the zero subsidence is unrealistic and, in my opinion, unattainable. And we have, and I'm not sure where the language is now, I've put in some language and modified it many times. We have put in language, but it's very short. I think it's only a sentence or two saying, this is our measurable objective. We do not think this is a realistic, I don't say it's not realistic. I say it's something like it's unlikely to be attained for various reasons, and I give a reason or two. But that's as far as I've gone. I've basically just said, we are putting this in as the measurable objective. We realize this is a placeholder that effectively means we're trying to minimize subsidence, but we will not get to that zero number for a number of reasons here. And you are right, we are putting that in basically to plant a flag in the ground, to say we are going the way you want, but we understand that this is an unattainable number here. It's not a long discussion in the GSP right now, but I did need to plant a flag there. Did that answer your question?
Yes, somewhat. I'd like to put you on the spot. How likely would that being our response to that particular DWR infraction, I guess, one of their responses to our plan, how likely is that response acceptable by DWR? How confident are you that that will be something that they will agree to accept?
I'm relatively confident about that they will accept it. Thanks for the question, actually. And this is where I give opinions, but partially that's what I'm paid for. My feeling is if we had said anything except zero subsidence, having heard from DWR, this is what we want to see. If we had put anything else in, that would have triggered a bigger concern among DWR. We are playing a much safer game by saying, this is what you told us, this is what we've put in, and it is a placeholder to mean we're going to minimize subsidence, but we believe it is unlikely to be achievable. I think that will be acceptable to DWR, and partially for the reason that I discussed, that measurable objectives don't have to be achieved to be sustainable. Minimum thresholds have to be avoided. Measurable objectives don't have to be achieved. And DWR knows this. So we are saying, this is our goal. It will be difficult to achieve. And DWR will know that. So good question. I feel like it is the best approach we have for responding to DWR in a way that they will approve it.
All things considered.
All things considered, exactly.
Jared, before I read off the other question, I'm just going to make a comment. I remember as a little kid hanging around the old timers and having them say, you know, they'd have a pipeline leak or something, and they'd always say, oh, this ground's always moving. And I found it fascinating as a kid. You know, I was looking down at the ground trying to see it move, you know. But I mean, our ground continues to move even back then when we had adequate surface water and weren't over drafting as much. The ground is constantly moving. We don't realize it, but it is. But on to the next question from Lee Johnson. Yes, are all of the monitoring points located in areas of historic subsidence, or are some located on historically stable land?
There are some monitoring points, not for the Mid-Kauai. The Mid-Kauai's monitoring points are all in areas of historical subsidence. The East Kauai has monitoring points that really show virtually zero subsidence. They are fairly stable, but that's because the geology is, the basin is very thin as you get to the east, and the geology is not that is not the type that leads to a lot of subsidence. So sub-basin wide, there are some monitoring points that have very little to no subsidence, but in the mid-Cahuilla, all of the monitoring points show historical subsidence.
Very good. Do we have any other questions before we move on? Doesn't sound like it, so
Good.
wait.
Thank you.
Did I hear something? No? Okay, take it away, Derek.
All right, thank you, Chair Martin. All right, so from here on out, it gets easier. If you've been through this much, you're pretty much home. Those are going to be the big issues. Those are the big parts of the GSP that we have replaced. Like I say, we have replaced the entire section for subsidence and the entire section for groundwater levels. Everything else is going to be a smaller replacement, a smaller edit. I will point out that there is an approach for addressing interconnected surface water deficiencies. We are not doing this, we are not changing this text in the mid-Cahuilla because the deficiency was not pointed at the mid-Cahuilla. However, Provost and Pritchard has been working very hard to address this deficiency for both the East and Greater Cahuilla. They will be developing a SMC for interconnected surface water based on whatever data we have now. This was a discussion with DWR. We informed them multiple times that we don't have good data to develop this. They kept saying, develop an SMC on what you have and you can change it in the future. So Provost and Pritchard is helping both the East and Greater develop this SMC. DWR, we believe, understands that they're based on very limited, very uncertain data. And so as part of this SMC, the East and Greater Cahuillas will have a work plan that says we are going to improve our data, we are going to understand the interconnection better, and then we will change this SMC in the future, which you are allowed to do. It's perfectly, and people forget this, you're allowed to change your SMCs in the future based on new data, new impacts, things like that. And so that's the approach that's being taken there. As I said, this doesn't have a direct impact on the mid-Cahuilla GSA, but you should know this is going on and we are at least being kept apprised of it. Provost and Pritchard keeps us in the loop to say, this is where we are going. We appreciate that, but we don't have a direct say in this one. There are some, as I said, after doing those deficiencies, the main deficiencies, there's a couple other changes that you're going to see, and those are necessary for consistency. One of them is the storage volume. This is how much water is in storage in your subbasin. And it is based on groundwater elevations. The higher the groundwater elevations, the more storage in volume, the lower the less storage volume in the less volume in storage, pardon me. Because the GSP, the minimum threshold for the amount of water we can have in storage is based on the minimum threshold of the groundwater levels. Because we changed the minimum threshold of the groundwater levels, we have to go in and change that minimum storage for that minimum threshold for the amount of water that's in storage. Just a straight math thing. There's a few tricks to it. I don't want to go into them right now, but effectively the consistency issue here is because our water level minimum thresholds changed, that translates directly into a change in the minimum threshold for the amount of groundwater in storage. And so we're not replacing that entire section. We're really just replacing some of the numbers with a little explanation, some of the numbers that are in the storage SMC, saying this now reflects the new groundwater level minimum thresholds. It wasn't required by DWR's letter, but we felt that it was important for consistency.
Derek, Richard Garcia had one last question on subsidence, and he was asking, what is the state of the art technology to measure subsidence? Is this satellite stuff or on-site monitor hardware?
Good question. I think it's a little uncertain. Both the satellite information and continuous GPS type of information. They are using, I think they are similar as far as accuracy goes. We've looked into this. The decision that I've come up with is if you use either one of them, you will be relatively accurate. You will be within the range of accuracy. There are some methods that are less accurate, but I think continuous GPS or satellite data, or even some extensometer data. Extensometer might be a little off, but they are all going to be within the same level of accuracy there. I forget if extensometer is in the same level of accuracy or not. So it doesn't really, for accuracy, it won't make a big difference there. But a very good question there. DWR does supply the satellite data every quarter now for free. Some people like it, some people do not like it. You have these monitoring sites already in your subbasin. That's what we're using now, and that's what we plan to use going forward. If we decide to change to satellite data, we can do that in the future, but it wasn't a focus of this GSP rewrite. The focus of this is to use the data you have, use the monitoring points you have, and be as consistent with historical information as possible. And so I think the data you have is quite accurate.
Another question from Jeff Vanderheuvel. Do we have an estimate of the total storage volume of the groundwater in the Kauai subbasin?
I have not made an estimate of the total storage volume. That's always a tricky thing to do, because the total storage volume is always a huge number. There's a huge amount of water under your feet. Let's face it, there is a huge amount of water under your feet. It can't be used, but it's there. So I have not made that estimate. All we have done, and I forget, I think that estimate was in the original GSP, and we have not, if it was, we have not changed it. All we have changed in the GSP is the discussion of what the minimum threshold is, how much storage could be depleted over time before we get to an undesirable result. We did not do any other estimates of the total storage in the basin. So that's only a half answer, but it's the right one.
If I could, Mr. Chairman, I think it would be helpful, maybe you can't do it quickly, or maybe not even now, but to know what, I mean, essentially what you're talking about is the working storage, essentially, right? The amount of water that we can work with.
Yes.
Nice to know what percentage of the total we're working with. I mean, is this 10% of the total, 50% of the total, 5% of the total? We really don't have any idea on scale. So when you look at this particular chart, it looks like, if you get to zero, you're out of water. We know that isn't true, but how much water is actually there?
I could look and see if those estimates are in the existing GSP. We could do that as a point of interest. Like I say, I don't think it's something we need to discuss.
Yeah, no, I agree. You guys are on a tight time frame. It's more for, future discussion.
But we can get that information to you then. Good, yeah.
Well, it's been some years ago, but it seems like I did hear a number. I couldn't give you anywhere close to what I was, but there was an estimate at one time.
No, it's in
what it's worth.
It's in the storage. It's there, and I don't want to say a number and get it wrong, but it's in there.
Yeah, I think it is in that
Yeah.
report still.
It's in the million acre foot, several million acre feet, but I can't remember what number it was.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? If not, do you have anything left for the presentation?
I do have a few more
Revision.
slides.
Okay, great.
One of them, though, this one I'm going to pass over to Aaron, because one of the other changes to the plan based on that basically was a ripple through effect is we updated the mitigation plan. And that shows up in chapter 7, which is the projects and management actions. And I'd like Aaron to talk a little about, because he's the one working on it with the other GSA members also, with the other GSAs. I'd like him to talk a little about the mitigation plan.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. And so as Derek presented in the chronic lowering of groundwater levels, we acknowledge that there's a need for a drinking water well mitigation program. Now, there will be wells through all categories that will potentially be impacted, but the concentration or the efforts that the GSAs felt should be contributed towards was mitigation for drinking well needs, or those that cannot afford to replace their wells. And so there was a commitment there to mitigate those impacts and try and estimate the cost. And Montgomery and Associates and Provost and Pritchard was able to help us get through some of that. And so what I'm going to show you here is really our initial approach. And this approach is kind of being negotiated and worked through right now. We had a good start on it, and then literally yesterday at 4 o'clock, we were still trying to work out some of the details. The last draft went out at 11 o'clock this morning with revisions coming back this 11 o'clock last night with revisions coming back this morning even. So and some of you I've talked to about this program, but what I'm going to present is where it stands right now. But be cautioned that there might be some revisions. So I'm going to take screen share back.
Okay.
Really quick. And describe a little bit about what we're calling the Kaweah Subbasin Drinking Water Well Mitigation Work Plan. This may just become a mitigation work plan, and we may include other forms of mitigation within this work plan. But for what I concentrated on was the drinking water aspect. We do know that there will be impacts to all of the wells. Again, we're trying to concentrate on those domestic and municipal wells. Our program right now, what's being developed currently is to mitigate for chronic lowering of groundwater levels and subsidence. During both discussions, we discovered that there's potential for impacts in both. So when you talk about chronic lowering of groundwater levels, you're talking about drying domestic wells or drinking water wells up. And as far as subsidence is concerned, we are getting some kind of, I would guess, anecdotal evidence that there could be subsidence impacts on deep drinking water wells. What we discovered just recently was if you're above the Corcoran clay, that doesn't seem to be a problem. When you go below the clay, you start to have the subsidence problem. So regardless, we want to address it, be prepared for it. So in talking with DWR, there was this I guess, thought process of a mitigation plan being required or requested, but can the GSAs and the advisory committee, specifically the Mid-Kaweah Advisory Committee, get to a full mitigation plan by July 27th? And that was really going to become apparent that it was unrealistic in 180 days to develop something of that nature with funding. Who gets the money? How do you distribute the money? So if we were to try and put something in the plan, it was really unrealistic from the very beginning. On the other end of the spectrum is we could put in just a list of bullet items that are kind of components of what a mitigation program would look like. And we didn't think that that was realistic enough to give confidence that we could mitigate for the difference in the wells that might go dry under the 90%. So what we came up with is a mitigation work plan, a commitment to develop mitigation programs in each one of the GSAs. So the 3 GSAs are committing to a mitigation program and a framework to develop that under, so it's coordinated across the Kaweah Subbasin. So let me give you a quick, and caution, I think I told you, it's still under development. This is the basics of it, and we're drafting it up right now in order to be put into the coordination agreement and the GSPs. So in the work plan, there'll be an outreach component, stakeholder outreach meetings at the Kaweah Subbasin level. The main outreach will be through the Kaweah Subbasin Management Committee meetings, but other meetings could be held when data is made available. We could have a workshop on, let's just say, domestic well counts, like where are we at? So we'll be working those out, and then each GSA will have their own outreach strategy at the GSA level. At the Mid-Kaweah, I anticipate all advisory committee meetings and ad hoc committees will be our outreach program. Work plan, so what are we protecting? We'll define the chronic lowering of groundwater levels and subsidence. And then we plan to do an evaluation of the current well data set that we have. And that's a combination of using existing databases that are out there, overlaying them and trying to figure out which wells have been replaced already, which ones are still subject to drying up at the minimum thresholds. And at the bare bones of it, it comes down to basically knocking on people's doors and establishing the age of the well, the depth of the well, and what conditions they're under. So that's work to be done ahead. We're anticipating trying to get at that immediately and be done by next year, March sometime. And those dates may change a little bit. Funding, you know, the Cahuilla Subbasin collectively works well together to get funding. I'm just happy to report in the last 6 months alone, $17.6 million has come in for SGMA related projects. So looking for funding for drinking water well mitigation is probably at the top of our list to try and get some funding in to get those wells replaced as soon as possible. The thought is, you know, trying to get some of these wells mitigated before they go dry is money ahead, because we don't have to provide an interim water supply after the well dries up. So again, try and identify some funding by, you know, first quarter of next year, and then try and apply for that money collectively. There is a component here of an interim mitigation program between now and when the programs are approved. The GSAs would consider an emergency pot of money to be used under kind of emergency criteria to kind of cover some of the wells that might be drying up currently, or if we turn into another dry year. So try and get that put together by the end of this year. Really bare bones structured framework to get things going. And then it's important for us to evaluate how the program's going, and we want to include that in our annual reports. We'll begin that next year. And then lastly, really the mitigation program framework is where the GSAs will utilize the framework that we've developed to fill in the blanks on how we intend to implement it. And that framework will be included in the coordination agreement. It's not a strict framework, it's just a guiding framework that each GSA can need to evaluate, you know, funding, who can apply, how they can apply, how do you distribute the money, and that sort of thing. And our commitment loosely right now is to try and have those programs developed by the end of next year, 2023. But those are all subject to implementation upon funding. So we will implement them as the funding is applied to the programs. Collectively, that's the work plan approach that will be incorporated into the coordination agreement, and then into the projects and management actions, chapter 7 of all the GSPs. We're able to crank out some quick numbers. Again, we will be truing these numbers up. These numbers are based on a well data set from 2002. So you can look here and see the number of wells that could be subject to impacts, or this is the true number of wells by GSA. And then you can look at the impacted wells. So for the Mid-Cahuilla, we anticipate out of the limited data set, we had a total of 21 wells that could potentially go dry in the Mid-Cahuilla alone if we go to the minimum thresholds. So we would be truing that number up and looking in the historical, you know, how many are actually out there as soon as we get past this submission to the GSP. So that's the program as we outlined to help mitigate for that, let's just say 10% not accounted for in the 90% protection level that Derek outlined earlier. So Derek and I are here if there's any questions on that approach. Any comments or questions?
Not seeing any, Aaron. Remember, this is work in progress, so I think everybody's got to give you a little flexibility here.
Okay. Let's see, where did my...
All right, can I share again then, Aaron?
Yes, I have to find where I can stop the share now.
Okay,
What's going on here?
this will,
Why don't you just take it over? I think you can just take it over.
I am going to actually.
There we
Aha, I'm in charge. Okay. There's only two more points I want to make here very quickly. These are for on the groundwater level SMC, the point I want to make here is, although we took a different approach, the minimum thresholds didn't change substantially. There were some changes, but the groundwater level minimum thresholds ended up in the same range as they were in the original 2020 GSP. A bit of a surprise, but that's just the way the math came out, and that's fine, even though it was a completely different approach. It's different for the subsidence SMC. The point I want to make here is the minimum thresholds are now allowing less subsidence than in the previous GSP. And the underlined point here, I don't want to be alarmist, but subsidence could become the governing SMC for your groundwater management. If you are trying to control subsidence, that might be the most difficult thing to do, and it might control your management activities the most. I'm not saying it will. I'm only stating this because subsidence is a difficult one. We don't like to think and work too much with it, but there is a possibility that it is going to be something that we are going to have to work with when we make management decisions going forward. So that's an important thing you want to be aware of that's coming out of this GSP. That is all I was going to say. I hope that this at least gives you enough information so if you do read the GSP, you now have a little guidebook so you know what we were trying to do and it makes a little more sense. And if you don't want to read the GSP, that's fine. You have already been told what the bottom line number is and you know where we're going. And that is all I had to present.
You know, I see the next topic scheduled for completion of groundwater sustainability plan revisions, but I think we've done that, haven't we?
I just have a quick couple notes on that, but
Okay.
you know, I did want to tell folks if what I'll probably do is upload this presentation with the red lines, so you can see, you know, if you want to use it as a cheat sheet to what you're reading, you can. I think that'll help, right, Derek?
Yes.
And let me just quickly go over so folks understand where the whole a bigger picture where the process is headed right now, because they're, you know, when is the submission happening and when is the review coming back? Just understand that, again, we're trying to submit this by July 27th here, and there's a public comment period that DWR is allowing for 60 days, I believe, and then they are going to evaluate the plans apparently very quickly, and we should have by the end of the year a determination again, and our target is to get an approval. I mean, we really worked hard. We really think we put a good faith effort in a process that works for us and DWR, and we can continue with our implementation. So that's our goal. For folks, again, just to review this meeting here is we're making red lines available here shortly. As soon as I get the PDFs, we're asking for, I'm sorry, I forgot to update this. This is July 12th now, and I'll put this presentation up there. You can see how fast things change on us. Between the 12th and the 19th, Montgomery will be processing changes, revisions, getting the documents ready to go. We plan to have that in front of the board, so anticipate a special board meeting on July 20th to approve the coordination agreement and GSP. And then we'll finalize those documents between the 21st and the 25th and be uploading it by between the 21st and the 25th. And by that time, we should be wrapped up and on with our process there. And if anybody wants to just get a snapshot of that, that'll link you straight to our website there. Any questions or comments from folks?
Yeah, this is Jeff. Just, fantastic job. And I really appreciate the work that you guys have done. And Derek, great work and great explanations, can really follow what you did and why. And it's really remarkable given the very short timeline and the kind of the complicated nature of doing what we're required to do without a whole lot of guidance. So just deeply appreciate the efforts and all the hard work that went to get us to this point. It sure looks like we're about there.
Thank you.
Jeff beat me to it. I was gonna say the same thing, although a little differently. And I just wanna thank the Kauai Subbasin GSAs and consultants for their hard work in getting the plan formulated for review and ready by the deadline date. Thank you all for your hard work.
Oh, well, coming from you, Mr. Stroman, it's even more important than Jeff. No, that's a joke.
Yeah, I think if I could just add to that, Derek oftentimes was, I think the subsidence had, I was just informed we had 4 different approaches that Derek evaluated or switched from, right, in and out of, in a 30-day window. That's analysis by, you know, every 15 minutes you're changing your analysis. So we appreciate it. Any other questions or comments or clarifications we can provide folks? Okay, the Chair Martin, I'll turn it back to you, or if you want me to move on, I only had one other quick item to update folks on.
Yeah, we have just a couple of comments, I believe.
Oh, okay.
If you want to.
Here we go again. I cannot.
We have kudos from Julie Allen. I agree with Jeff. Clear explanations of process and results. Thank you. And then Jesse states, I have to leave for another meeting, but I enthusiastically agree with the comments of the others. Great job, amazing work. And I can't scroll down anymore. I think, oh, an excellent, clear presentation. Thank you. I agree with all those comments. I find it hard if we don't make past muster, they just don't want anybody to succeed, I think. If there's nothing else for that, let's go ahead and take it to legislation. Give us an update on 2201.
Yeah, I just wanted to provide the group, since we had the time, and there's this kind of somewhat hot off the press, you know, Assembly Bill 2201. The Mid-Kauai board took an oppose unless amended standpoint on it. There is a small group, and Jeff Vandenheuvel, myself, and Cassie Shawhan from the North Kings GSA seemed to form a good group of folks with a like-minded effort to try and position the bill in a way that was useful to the GSAs and implementable by the GSAs. So we met with the assembly member on June 15th, and it was apparent to us that the bill was meant to protect existing groundwater users in overdrafted basins. And what I mean by that is he kept acknowledging that his goal was to not allow corporate agriculture to come into a basin and create a new demand on an existing subbasin that's already struggling with its groundwater conditions. And we explained to him that the way it's drafted, it's not drafted that way. It's meant to stop all well permitting and including replacement wells, because the way that permits are interpreted by counties, all permits when they come in are quote unquote new permits. And so there was this kind of like two-party acknowledgement. I think we understand both sides, the assembly member and our small group, that some amendments are needed. So he agreed to entertain some amendments. We submitted those amendments to him, and we did not do it in a vacuum. We tried to share those with some folks out there to kind of get some feedback or opposition. We really didn't get any. And then let's see, 2 weeks ago, it was heard in the Senate Governance and Finance Committee. Unfortunately, we were given some bad dates. We thought that meeting was July 27th, but it was actually June 27th. So we kind of had to rush, and we did, that committee is chaired by Senator Caballero, which the Kings area and Madera area is in her district. They were able to reach out to her. She did share some concerns, but unfortunately, it did pass that committee with amendments, which we're yet to see yet, but it did pass the Governance and Finance Committee. So we're still coordinating with the assembly member to get those amendments that were approved. And I'll be back to the board to either reconsider our positions, keep our position, or get further direction on that. But my sense is the bill is moving forward. I'm hoping the amendments are put it in a better situation to be more implementable on that. And that's my only report there.
So the amendments, you don't have a clue what the amendments are.
I was not there. Maybe Jeff can add, but my understanding was a very awkward situation because the amendments were almost accepted on the fly or behind the scenes. So when the Governance and Finance Committee, there was no really document to route around to everybody. So I put an email into the Assembly member's office, but I think because of the 4th of July holiday, we're not hearing anything yet back from them.
Jeff, you got anything to add on that, or?
Well, yeah, watching the committee work and the discussion, it seems that Assemblyman Bennett doesn't want, this is supposed to apply to new wells only. Senator Caballero said, yeah, I get that, but what your bill actually says doesn't do what you say you want. And that's been our concern, when he's talked to us, well, when his public statements and even talking to us, we seem like we're in agreement, but we haven't seen changes to the bill that are faithful to what he's saying. So there were some amendments that were apparently part of what that Senate Governance and Finance Committee passed, but we, like Aaron said, we were not able to see them, and the request that Aaron put in to get it has not yet been responded to. Request to Assemblymember Bennett for the updated language. So I think when we get it, we'll have a better idea where we're at on it.
Aaron, I've got a question. If you're not sure, I think Valerie's here. She could probably answer. What is the next step since it passed the committee? What's the next step? Does it go to the floor, or do they discuss it? What happens next?
I think it was passed to one more committee, right, Jeff?
What I heard was it was going to another committee, but I'm not sure which, whether it was appropriations or whether it had to go back to the Senate, water equivalent of the water committee. So we've got to get clarification here later this week on exactly what the status of this bill is and what it actually says now that it's out of that committee.
Valerie, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, usually things go to appropriations, but it depends on if the changes are going to send it back. So part of that might be based on changes.
Okay. So we don't know. Okay, if there's no more questions regarding that we don't know anything about anyway. Number 5, board staff updates, future agenda items or other topics of interest. Anything for that?
The only thing I'll note for everybody is I've asked the board members to keep a placeholder on their calendar for the regular meeting on July 12th. I would say it's less than a 50-50 chance we're going to need that. Things are moving along as designed. So I think what we'll do is target the July 20th meeting. Are you inclined to have it at 1 o'clock again? I'm available at 1 o'clock on July 20th. If Derek and other board members, I'll poll the board again, but I could do 1 o'clock on the 20th. It actually works kind of better in my schedule.
I can do whatever works for everybody else, actually.
Okay.
So I'll leave it up to the majority. If not, Valerie, I did have one more question for you. There were those 4 GSAs that were the first ones that got reviewed, and 2 were accepted and 2 were incomplete. Do you know if the other 2 have progressed, or are they on the same timeline as us and they're just going to wait until the 27th?
Yep, that's my understanding, that even though there was that early back and forth, that DWR set their timeline at 180 days from when they turned, from when they received their official assessment from DWR. So they are on a similar timeline within a day or so of us. I did see that there's been one basin that turned in their plan already. But I frankly forget what it was, but I did get a DWR notification that they did post it for 60 days. But nowhere near, obviously not in the Kauai Basin.
Steve Nelson says that he's good to mess up my power nap on the 20th. Does anybody else have any other comments, questions? If not, we will adjourn this meeting. Thank you, everyone. Good
Thanks,
meeting.
everybody.
Thank you.